Hello everyone. Los Angeles, that night, seemed to be morning beneath a dark sky choked with smoke. A massive fire was raging on the west side of the city, sparing nothing. Buildings rich in history, homes filled with memories, and iconic places that had deeply rooted themselves in the hearts of the people, all became victims of the uncontrollable fire. The wails of sirens and panicked screams filled the air as flames quickly devoured nearly everything in its path. Amid this chaos, there was one building that remained untouched, an old mosque that had stood for over a century, right in the heart of the city. While the flames spread rapidly across the streets, this mosque stood firm, seemingly impervious to the destructive force around it. From the outside, it looked no different from any other night. Its simple structure and faded green dome were hardly remarkable. But that night, the mosque became a witness to a miracle. The fire that ravaged everything else nearby had spared this one building, leaving only minor burns on its roof. A miracle that was hard to believe. People who were running in panic stopped in their tracks as they saw this sight. Their eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. A mosque, a place of worship they typically saw as a quiet refuge, had suddenly become a symbol of strength and endurance, as if it were signaling that, even though their world was crumbling, something could still survive. Word quickly spread about the mosque that had survived the fire. At first, it was just a few curious people who came to verify the truth. But soon, the crowd grew. Not just Muslims, but people from all walks of life began gathering, eager to witness the miracle for themselves. They wanted to see it with their own eyes. They wanted to understand how this mosque had managed to survive in the midst of a blazing inferno. Among the crowd stood a man named Amir, staring blankly at the mosque. He had just lost his home, which he had lived in for as long as he could remember. In his eyes, there was deep sorrow, but also one lingering question: why was this mosque spared while everything else was destroyed? Beside Amir, a young woman named Sarah gripped the hand of her young child. They stood silently in the crowd, unsure of what to do next. Their home had been consumed by the fire, and now they had nowhere to go. Sarah didn't know where to turn. She only knew one thing: this mosque, this place that had withstood the flames, felt like a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. It was a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still something to hold on to. Is this a sign? Or just a coincidence? Sarah muttered to herself, her eyes closing for a brief moment. Meanwhile, behind them, the crowd continued to swell. People began talking to one another, not just out of curiosity about the mosque's survival, but because they were looking for something more. Something to believe in. Something to help them cope with the devastation around them. They spoke of what should be done next, about how to help those who had lost everything, how to rebuild their lives. Amir let out a long breath. There was something different about this mosque. He could feel it. It wasn't just the building itself, or even luck. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was a sign. A sign that even in the wake of destruction, there was something worth holding on to. As the days passed, the crowd grew larger. People didn't just come to see the mosque anymore, they came to find meaning, to seek answers in a time when everything felt lost. They began to talk about turning the mosque into a shelter for those who had nowhere to stay, about using it as a distribution center for food and supplies. Some even spoke of turning it into a sanctuary for those who had lost their jobs and livelihoods. The days passed, and the crowd continued to grow. No one knew yet what this would turn into. But they all shared one thing in common: they needed something. They needed hope. Amir couldn't shake the feeling that something larger than themselves was unfolding here. The mosque, which had once been just a place of worship, was now something more. It was the last thing standing amidst the ashes, a symbol of survival and resilience. Days passed after the fire ravaged Los Angeles, and the mosque that had survived the flames had become a symbol of hope and recovery. A place that not only sheltered those who had lost everything but also united people from all walks of life in a shared purpose, rebuilding together. The mosque, once a quiet place of worship, now stood as the center of a movement driven by solidarity, support, and resilience. That morning, Amir woke up with sore muscles. He had been sleeping in one of the temporary tents set up outside the mosque for the past few days. Despite the physical exhaustion, he felt a sense of lightness in his heart. Today, the mosque, which had once only served as a place of prayer, had turned into the heart of recovery for the entire city. People from every corner of the city, no matter their background or faith, had come together, working side by side. Free meals were being provided to anyone who needed them, temporary shelters were set up around the mosque for those who had nowhere to go, and supplies like food, water, and medicine were being distributed. Amir walked toward the makeshift kitchen that had been set up outside the mosque. There, a few volunteers were busy preparing meals. Sarah was among them, chopping vegetables. Though her face was tired, her smile remained bright, and it gave everyone around her a sense of encouragement. "Good morning," Amir greeted as he approached Sarah. "Morning, Amir. Can you help chop some tomatoes?" Sarah asked, handing him a knife. "We need to make more today. Hundreds of people come every day." Amir took the knife and began to chop. Though his effort seemed small, it felt significant. Each slice of vegetable, each serving of rice, was part of something bigger. Something that gave him hope. Around them, the atmosphere was busy but full of energy. People were talking about how they could start rebuilding the homes that had been destroyed. Some were planning to fundraise, while others were focused on repairing basic infrastructure. There were even discussions about creating a place for education for the children who had lost their schools. The idea of rebuilding was in the air, not just physically but emotionally, restoring both the city and its people. Inside the mosque, things were taking a different turn. In the main prayer hall, several community leaders were gathering to discuss the next steps. Amir, Sarah, Michael, and others were sitting at a large table, strategizing their plans for the future. "This is about more than just feeding people and providing shelter," Michael said, his voice serious. "We need to think about the future. We need places for education, job training, and healthcare. We need to rebuild not only physically but emotionally as well." Amir nodded in agreement. "Exactly. A lot of people have lost their jobs, and many are dealing with trauma. We need to offer not just homes, but mental and emotional support. This needs to happen in tandem with everything else we're doing." Sarah added, "We could start with offering job skills classes, vocational training. A lot of us are starting from scratch, and it will be easier if we support one another." The conversation continued throughout the day, and despite the challenges ahead, there was a positive energy in the room. They knew that, although the fire had taken much from them, they wouldn't let their city disappear. They would rebuild it, stronger, more united. Outside, as evening fell, the crowd around the mosque began to grow. New people were arriving after long journeys, bringing supplies and offering moral support. Volunteer groups from outside the city had set up posts around the mosque, ready to provide further assistance. Amir stood in front of the mosque, watching as the crowd gathered. No longer was there fear or despair in their faces. There was a shared sense of purpose in every step they took. And the mosque, which had stood resilient amid the fire, had become the focal point of all their hopes. Inside, Sarah and Michael were speaking with a group of volunteers, planning the distribution of aid for the coming days. Michael nodded as they agreed to organize more tents and sleeping arrangements, and to plan for an educational program for children who had lost their schools. "We'll need more volunteers for that," Michael said, his eyes gleaming with determination. Behind all of this, there was a strong feeling that united them. Not just the will to survive, but the will to create something bigger than themselves. It all started with the mosque that survived the fire, which now had become not just a place of worship but a center for recovery. Amir looked at the mosque once again. "We can get through this," he whispered to himself. "We'll rebuild this city. Together." Over time, the mosque became not just a physical sanctuary, but also a place of emotional and spiritual healing. Many who had never heard of Islam began to learn, inspired by the strength and serenity they felt inside the mosque. Eventually, many of them, including Sarah, converted to Islam, finding the mosque a symbol of hope, resilience, and unity. The devastated city slowly began to rebuild, and the mosque that survived the fire became a center of not just physical but spiritual revival, bringing people from all walks of life together to rebuild their lives through the power of faith and solidarity.